My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I'm luckily joined now, as always, by the ever so handsome Max Aita. How's it going, Max?
Damn, that's the best intro I've ever gotten. Just the overwhelming amount of just praise saturating my headphones right now is just fantastic. But yes, all those things are true, and I am doing very well, having a good day.
Yeah, and we actually just got done recording an episode of the Weightlifting AI podcast, weightlifting.ai podcast.
Yep.
So it's cool to see that I don't know how, but it's grown legs. So it's cool to see that kind of cranking out some episodes. So if people want to go check that out, pretty much every podcasting platform, Spotify, Spreaker, all those, you can just type in weightlifting AI and it'll come up. And then, we were thinking, we just talked about the long-term considerations for becoming a weightlifting coach. And I was thinking, Max, you've gone from weightlifting to powerlifting, been one of the very few people, I think, one to make the jump, but also to go in that order. I mean, we've seen people like Travis Mash go from in Shane Hammond go from powerlifting to weightlifting. I think that's kind of like normal. You're one of the only people really to go from weightlifting to powerlifting, competing, and then coaching at the highest level you can really coach at in powerlifting. You mentioned after I brought that up that you signed up for a powerlifting meet.
Yeah. So I signed up for a meet today. Joanne and I, funny enough, we've both competed. We've both been involved in these sports I started, I say I started when I was like 12-ish, a little after 12. But I was lifting weights and then, in high school, I started really seriously training. But we've both been doing it for 20 years. We've never actually done a competition together. We never did a weightlifting meet together. We've technically been we did one powerlifting meet, but it was 2 different days, and it was kind of not really the same thing. I want to do a meet where we both show up and compete on the same day, and it'd be just a fun thing. So that's kind of what this is for. It's also because I just haven't been training much at all. The last few years, you've seen it. My problem is I was all in or nothing, and that's the same in everything I do. So if I'm focusing on the app or building that stuff, I'm all in. I'm just sitting there in front of the computer trying to figure out, okay, what needs to be designed and built and all this. And so I just lose track of I should be doing something else, and so training is always the thing that kind of falls off, but I'm excited. Joe's coaching me. Joanne's going to coach me for this meet. So if it doesn't go well, it's her fucking fault. If I don't do a 2,000 total, it's her fault.
And have you ever bombed out at a meet before, or is this going to be the first time?
This will be the first time in a powerlifting meet I bomb out. I'll tell you right now. One time I tore my hamstring, and so for whatever, I don't know why I did this, but for whatever reason, I entered bench only at Mark's gym. And get this, hold on. The only other guy in raw bench only who I beat because he missed all 3 of his attempts was Eric Spoto.
Oh, Jesus.
So I can claim that I've outbenched. I beat Eric Spoto head to head in a bench competition, bench only. We both entered it. I only made 1 bench. He made 0. It was so bad. I hated benching so much. I can't stand it. But
Oh,
yeah,
the reason it's funny and the reason we laugh is because you squatted. I think you said it was like 738 pounds.
yeah,
You deadlifted over 700 pounds, and then every time you mention your bench,
yeah.
it's like, yeah, I benched 160 kilos.
Which actually wasn't like it's not a terrible bench. It's just not good. It's not like anything in powerlifting I would like, at 100 kilos. It's just nothing. Uh,
Right.
but whatever. I mean, I never took that part. I never really like was. I liked powerlifting when I was doing it, and I was like really enjoyed the people and like hang out with Jesse Burdick and Mark and Chad Smith. Like all these people were like that was enjoyable to me, and like it's easy. It's just I can't describe to you how much easier powerlifting is once you've done weightlifting. Like there's just something about like if you're a good weightlifter or a decently talented weightlifter, going into powerlifting just feels like this is the easiest sport in the world. Like you don't have to jump under a bar. There's people that are there to save you. Like if you can't make it. And like so like none of it was like that whole element is gone. So it's just like, oh, if you work really fucking hard, you'll be a good powerlifter. Right. If you can just put in the work, you'll get better. Um, so yeah, this is a very different energy, very different vibe.
No, and I did want to talk about the movement from weightlifting to powerlifting as an athlete, as a coach, and kind of get your thoughts on that. But before I do that, you mentioned that you pretty much have been lifting weights or been in weightlifting, informally since you were around like 12 years old. You started
Yeah.
kind of moving around weights, and you've lifted for the last 20 years and lifted at like a really high level. I mean, we mentioned you squatting 738 pounds, snatching 140 kilos, clean and jerking 170, and hitting a ton of like really really impressive lifts. But we've also talked about how you trained during those 20 years. And at some point, you talk about kind of working with Shaco and things changing pretty dramatically to where no sets were really high RPE, no sets were really close, very, very close to a max. Bar speed was high, quality was really high, the volume was, pretty high. And, how you saw success on that. If we kind of rewound to when you got into lifting around 12 to 15 years old, maybe even 18, and we think about the state of weightlifting as it is now, or the state of weightlifting and powerlifting, if we're just thinking about like squat numbers or snatch and clean and jerk, what do you think you could have done if you came into weightlifting and you got coaching as like a 13 or 14-year old, and kind of you were able to take advantage of what we know about training, what we know about kind of like the science of
Hmm.
training? What do you think you would have been able to accomplish?
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. Built with the intention to move with you and work for you, we create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL, for 10% off.
I think I would have been a better lifter, technically. Um, I that's such a tough question to answer because, like, on one side, like, a lot of the problem, a lot of my, like, I mean, yeah, let me try to structure this in a way that makes sense. You know, I wouldn't say like I had a failed career. I just didn't really have much of a career. I didn't really ever go to like the biggest mistakes I made, the biggest things that I would change, that I think could change were being more aware that like, hey, go to nationals as soon as you have a chance, even if you're going to get last place, because that will ignite a different level of like you'll just get exposure to what the real sport is, right? Like you're going to be involved around people that lift. You're going to be invested in it. You're going to meet people and make connections. And those things would have accelerated a lot of other stuff that would have, you know, changed everything about the way I trained and competed and thought about the sport. So the biggest thing was like, you know, I qualified for nationals and like I would just be like, well, I'm not going to go because it's expensive and I'm not going to win, right? But that's like the stupidest mentality. It's the worst mentality you can have because it's like, yeah, like even if you were really good, you might not win. So like, wow, well, you got to show up. It doesn't matter if you're in the B session and you're getting or J session or whatever, and you're going to get, you know, 10th in that session. Being there is part of the sport. It's participating, and it's going to reward you down the line in ways you don't necessarily understand, you know, in that current time. So that first off would have been like the biggest change is to like actually just participate as much as possible. Training is not the sport of weightlifting. What happens in the gym is it just is not the sport of weightlifting, you know. And I can say that now, like having done every level of the sport, you know, having done it as an athlete, has done it as the, you know, I've been the king of the gym, you know, trained harder than a lot of people. I, you know, have competed at, you know, a high level, you know, national level in weightlifting, I've competed a high level in powerlifting. I've coached in both of those levels, coached at the highest levels in both sports. And now, you know, as a commentator, even with Weightlifting House, seen it from the completely other side, from the total spectator side. And I can say that like the parts of the sport that are most real are happening in the arena, on the platform, you know, back and forth fighting, you know, training hall, like that's the real stuff. It's not the king of the gym stuff. Um, from the perspective of the sport, you know, from the perspective of being a competitive lifter. Uh, I think that was the biggest thing I missed out on, the way I did stuff.
Yeah. So you think that would have transformed kind of the way you
Yeah,
approach training?
yeah, I think it would have had a cascading effect, right? I think I would have gone to more of those meets, met a lot more people, formed relationships with them, and been more comfortable to ask questions and to consider changing things. You know, my coach was amazing. Steve Goff was an incredible man, incredible coach. Um, but you know, there were certainly like, you know, his method of doing things and the way we did things, it didn't produce the best results in me that I think. And I say that, you know, people probably hear me say this a lot. I don't think I did poorly. I don't think I got less far than maybe I would have. But I know there were areas that if I was coaching myself, you know, if I met myself when he was that age, I could have gotten myself further along, you know, because I could just see, like, okay, you're doing these wrong, these things wrong, this wrong. Like, you can fix this, you can improve this. I know how to make this better. You know, you front squat what 230 and you clean 150. Like, let's let's do something other than front squat. You know, so for sure, I would have made changes, for you know that I think would have been better. Um, I didn't understand as a younger coach, I didn't understand the magnitude of small effects, small, like incremental changes being applied thoroughly and consistently. And I neglected those. I glossed over those a lot. And I think that's really common for newer coaches. I think it's really common for male coaches as well. Is to just like you can see the difference. It's like people that gloss over the minutia oftentimes get subpar results, right? Um, yeah, so I think that's for sure stuff that would have been better, would have
Yeah.
changed.
No, that makes sense entirely. And as you transition from weightlifting to powerlifting, obviously you were able to take a lot from weightlifting and push it into how you coached in powerlifting and how you thought about programming and training, because a lot of the training theory is kind of founded on the same stuff. But did powerlifting tend to teach you anything? I mean, you kind of mentioned it being quite a bit easier, but did it tend to teach you anything about weightlifting or coaching weightlifters or just like coaching in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know now if it's the case, but I think at the time I started powerlifting, uh, there was a lot more availability to like programming and theory and training theory in powerlifting than there was in weightlifting.
Hmm.
It's funny because weightlifting felt like there was a lot of knowledge about the sport, and a lot of like money and time and research had gone into the sport, from Soviet Union, and just in general, there's a lot of well researched, uh, the sport was well researched and well understood, but it always felt like a lot of weightlifting training was just like, it was so like intuitive. And maybe that's just that happened to be at that era, it was just very intuitive for a lot of people. Um, people would have like, it was like one of two things. Either people in weightlifting would do like pre-written programs, like, oh, this is the Calpians program, or this is the Catalyst program, or this is the so and so program. And there wasn't a lot of like deviation from that. Or it was like, oh, I just kind of train and I go heavy, when I need to, or I max out a lot, or I just, I'm just train as hard as possible. You got to do double days. Everyone's got to do double days, and you got to do, if you're not squatting every workout, what are you doing, right? Whereas powerlifting was way more methodical. You'd get into it and you'd see people, and there was programs. It was like, you could do Ed Cohen's program, or you could do Westside program, or whatever. But there was a much more methodical approach because it was so fucking obvious if you did well. Like, you could go to weightlifting meet and train for 10 weeks for it and miss a few lifts and be like, oh man, I was close on that. And it's like, oh yeah, it was a 1 kilo PR and you were really close to making it. Like, your training's probably effective.
Right.
But you go to powerlifting meet and you train for 12 weeks and you don't make your squat go up. It's like, well, that training cycle was not effective. You got nothing out of it. So I think that was one of those things where like, it's just like so much easier to measure progress. It was so much more obvious. And so it's like, oh shit, like if you don't make someone's squat go up, like, or someone's bench go up, like you're not doing your job. And that definitely was like a driving force in like, that's what I saw right away. It was like, you should see tangible results when you train. If you're not, it's like something's not right,
Yeah, and I wonder if it's just a matter of like more people, the barrier for powerlifting being lower. So if more people are able to get into it, there's going to be more interest. There are going to be potentially more coaches, more developed ways of kind of programming or thinking about programming. And then kind of like it's just like the cycle basically where like more comes in, more goes out, more comes in, more goes out.
Yeah.
Whereas in weightlifting, and I kind of had this thought when I was like reading a bunch of stuff and kind of listening to people talk about programming, is everyone, nearly everyone refers to the Russian manuals. It's almost like a meme at this point. It's like, yeah, the Russian manuals. It's like, that's the resource. It's like, well, they had 800 weightlifters and they did all this rigorous research, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. But I think that was almost a crutch to where it provided so many of the answers that there wasn't a need to look for more problems, or look for like more nuanced problems or different problems, because you had answers. So it's like, that's kind of like all we need, or all we, now we need to just build on this in the gym or something. So I feel like, in powerlifting, you don't really have that. And when you did, it was Westside. And we saw kind of what that did, is it really captured like a large amount of powerlifters and really kept people from, I guess, like developing more sophisticated programming strategies, because
or
they
getting
would just,
strong.
yeah, right, because they would just do Westside. So, I mean, what's your take on that? Do you feel like the Russian manuals almost act as like a placeholder for like, this is the only weightlifting theory we need?
Yeah, I think it's misdirected, right? I look at, and I'm not sure, I'd be curious to hear what you think, but like I look at the Russian manuals, I look at like all of the basically written research that we have access to about weightlifting. And I was initially, I would read that stuff over and over and over again, and I'd make the mistake of getting fixated on what do the numbers mean? Like, okay, snatch. What is the snatch volume percentage at 85%? Oh, it should be 22.9%, right? And like, if you hit these magical numbers, that must be with the secret to like, that's what makes them so good. I mean, it's actually, the secret is 22.9, D-ball every day. But what I think was lost, what I didn't get until much later, was what are the emerging principles here that matter, like, and how to look at all this research, all this information from the perspective of the scientific principles that govern training,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's where it's like, if you understand the principles, when you read, any kind of training methodology, it starts to become very obvious what's going on. Oh, okay, I get what they're saying here. Like, these are what they've found to be effective, that they found in top people. What are the principles that are informing, that would help me inform decision making to get closer to this, right? It's not about mimicking. It's about uh, being similar, right? Apply that information to a program, and through the lens of the principles. But I do think that, like, when it's just like, hey, here's all this information, people get stuck in it, and they will just grab it and do whatever. And you see this all the time. I'm sure with, like, things I've written, things you've talked about, like,
Mm-hmm.
someone gets a program from somebody or reads an article from the coach, and suddenly that becomes like, oh, this is like the gospel, and we just do this, you know and yeah, so I think they definitely, like, it definitely stifles critical thinking when you have just like a limited resource of knowledge.
And that's why this particular episode of the podcast is interesting. It's because it's looking at how you developed as an athlete and as a coach in weightlifting, and then kind of parlayed that into powerlifting, but then took influence from this other barbell sport, and then parlayed that potentially back into weightlifting. And I think a lot of the people in weightlifting who have a sharp perspective, they just have a lot of people who have influenced them. They have
Yeah.
um, a lot of different like mentors or coaches they looked up to. They've read a bunch of different research and different maybe in different sports, but also just like at different levels, and kind of looking at like detraining and like, oh, how quickly do you lose muscle mass? And it's like, it's kind of relevant, and it's relevant in a certain way and in a certain context, but like having that kind of understanding of like, oh yeah, systems can detrain, and you need to like stimulate systems so frequently or to a certain degree to get them to improve. And I think having those different lines of information coming in allow coaches to develop in the face of maybe a sport, or maybe if you're in a place where like you're not sure what else to read, because you've already read a handful of books, you've read whatever the Russian manuals have to offer, and you're like kind of thinking about like, well, how can I approach this problem of improving weightlifting performance more effectively from a different perspective? And that would be, maybe you go to powerlifting, you look at guys like Mike Teixeira, or you look at guys like, I mean, and Boris Shako was in weightlifting, but you got look at guys like Boris Shako, and you take those concepts or the
Hmm.
ways you mentioned, they kind of manipulate the principles, and you start thinking about how you can do that. And I know your conversation with Sergey, which was episode 13 of the weightlifting.ai podcast, was incredible, and it was kind of answering or asking and trying to answer those same questions of, here are these ways of thinking about these training variables and applying them in a program. Um, why do you do it? How do you do it? What does that look like? And that's from someone who has one of the most extensive educations
Hmm.
in the sport. Um, so I think that's always helpful. Um, so did your time competing in powerlifting kind of, I guess, add much color to that, or
Yeah.
was it really only coaching?
Yeah, it did. I think it definitely created a big um, space for me to be creative and to think more creatively. Like, how can I apply some of this logic to something else, right? I mean, even today, like, every single time I watch somebody do something, I don't obsess over it. Like, I don't think to myself, like, why is he doing that? Like, oh my God, is there something special about that? If you watch someone in the training hall,
Hmm.
Europeans. I just watched. I don't know if I showed you the video. I just watched. This is a couple weeks back. I just watched Gore Manassian do clean grip snatches, and he was catching them like super deep. And you know, the 15 years ago, Max would have been like, "Oh my God, why is he doing that? What's the secret? Why he's prescribed the program exactly this way and that way?" And now I realize, like, he's probably just doing something light and to fuck around, right? It probably has some merit. He might do it regularly. I don't think it's like something he's never done. He just did for the sake of it. But it's like, okay, he's doing something that's like, you know, relatively relatively difficult. It's actually very hard. And what that does is it reduces the intensity, right? So the relative difficulty is high, but the absolute load's low. It's a light day, but it gives him a chance to like try hard at something, keep that relative intensity high, without exhausting him. And say, okay, I can kind of grasp that. It's a suitable thing to fit in there. Probably a lot by feel. But yeah, it's like I could look at that now and be okay, like, kind of wrapping my mind around it. Maybe he has a completely different reason for it, and I could ask, but yeah, I can kind of grasp that. When I got into powerlifting, there was a lot of stuff that was just very obvious, right? There's not a lot of like, there wasn't a lot of like superfluous training in powerlifting where you're like, oh, why is this guy doing? I mean, I guess there was with Westside, like, oh, why is he guy with 4 bands and chains and a slingshot and a board, and he's doing like a 2-inch range of motion, but it's also reverse band. Like, okay, like none of that makes sense. But you could look at somebody like, oh, this guy's doing like a lot of training volume of the main movements here, and he's, Shaco was much more like, I think, a good example of that, because like, okay, this training is just very sensible. There's a lot of volume at relatively challenging percentages, but nothing extreme, and it gives you an exceptional sort of environment to perfect technique in and solidify your technique, and at the same time develops a tremendous amount of strength. It's like this makes a lot of sense. And so you can kind of pull back and see the bigger picture and say, how can I apply some of this to athletes, right? I actually did, actually, Joanne would always refer to it as, you remember that Shaco program you wrote for weightlifting, but I took a lot of the principles I had learned with Shaco and talked to him about in training, and I wrote a weightlifting program that was more similar to like Shaco. It was a lot of volume, and Joe and another lifter in our gym did this program. It was really effective. It worked very well. It was also a ton of volume. So there was like that to understand that like it wasn't just like some secret. It was like, oh, how can I get this lady to do even more volume than she's done before without breaking her, And she was exhausted, but she made PRs the competition. And she probably made PRs even like a few weeks after, I'm guessing, because she was probably just run down too much. But it gave me more insight that, okay, this was a productive way to get a ton of training volume in, and manage the stresses, manage fatigue well without, just hammering her, or crushing someone. Whereas like when I was doing weightlifting, it was like, oh yeah, I could do a shitload of volume, but it was just trash. It was just a ton of volume that didn't do a lot. I trained and squatted so many times a week that, I was in there all day, every day, but like it just wasn't as productive. I wasn't front squatting 300 kilos. Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of like one thing I feel like I gathered from some powerlifting coaches, was just like, do what's effective, right? If it's working and you're making progress, you should be able to measure it and see it, uh, actually realizing itself in your training.
Yeah, and I think that anecdote with Gore is really insightful, and I think sometimes we've talked about this. Sometimes I get pretty far removed from what it was like to be a new coach or a new
Yeah,
weightlifter or someone who's newly interested in the sport, and they have those glasses on that would show Gore clean grip snatching like 150 and be like, that's a new exercise I've never seen. I need to do that. It's really going to change my lifting. And I think that's actually part of the Armenian system. And their system is probably super effective, and I need to figure it out. Then you kind of start thinking about it like, oh yeah, it's like a good technical exercise,
yeah,
possibly, and it really reduces the load, and it's good variety. It's not just
yeah.
snatching again. Um, do you think when you kind of make that transition from um, that like magic surrounding a system or an exercise or an idea to this is kind of like logic driven or intuition driven, and there's decision making that goes into it, and you can kind of like you can kind of dissect it and understand it from that perspective, or you can say like, oh, it was really just random, and you realize that like those system like all systems are kind of based on those two things, intuition, randomness, and kind of like logic. Do you think that impacted the way you kind of think about the sport or how you feel about it? Because I know you've mentioned, when you're thinking about having a specific focus in the weightlifting AI, it's like, do we want like a Russian style program or something? Like, does that make sense? And do people still think that way or like thinking about training in that way? When you kind of became removed from that, how did that change the way you think about or I guess perceive weightlifting?
That's a good question. There's a lot of like training that is potentially, or not systematic, right? It's somewhat haphazard,
Hmm.
right? It's a collection of ideas, like it's a collection of like, a couple of like thoughts and like, oh, I did this, I did that, like I'm gonna throw these things together, um, you know, and that is not process driven. um, I think that's the sort of thing that I would probably say I got most out of as far as anything goes with training. Really, really with anything in all of my career as a coach was
Hmm.
to learn to be process driven, right? Um, and use bigger picture things to make decisions and to drive things. And like you said, even like some of the idea of like randomness. I mean, nothing is random, right?
Hmm.
Like there's a neuron, a synapse that fires in your brain for whatever reason that makes you decide to choose something, right? So there's a bias that exists as to like, oh, I'm going to randomly
Right.
randomly pick a number. You just can't, right? Like there's
Right.
some bias that exists there. So even the idea of like randomness is something that is, potentially like a process. It's something that exists in
Hmm.
in the spectrum of all these decisions.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
No, and from that whole randomness standpoint, it's funny because I said it, and that's kind of how it feels. It's like, oh, we'll do let's do low hang snatches because we just need to do those, and we just want a snatch exercise, and it's like, yeah, but there's probably like logic you don't have access to, or you're making
Right.
this decision based on something that like maybe you're not going to bring to awareness, or maybe just isn't strongly like you can't like strongly defend it. So you would say you have more or less logical decisions. Some are
Yes.
based on kind of like flimsy logic, and some are based on like well-founded, thoughtful, like purposeful logic of these things tend to be correlated, or these things tend to be sequenced well together, and we're going to work on targeting this specific technical inefficiency. So like when you stack those up, you tend to get a program that looks like this, and the retrieval of that information can be more or less conscious, but it's not random. It's just because you don't think about it doesn't make it random. It's just
Yeah.
like, have you done the
Yeah.
work to make that lack of thinking more effective?
Yeah. I think this is like a topic I'm really interested in, actually, the idea of like randomness and variability and variation in programming. You've done some programs I've written, and you probably could recognize some level of like seeming, I don't know the right way to describe it, not chaotic, but it is, the goal is to have, the goal is like people are very good at recognizing patterns.
Hmm.
And I think the first step of initiating the process of, I won't say overtraining, but of initiating the process of monotony setting in, which is basically like the beginnings of when overtraining is going to start to occur. Overtraining is maybe not the right term, but like
Hmm.
stagnation is pattern recognition, right? Once you start to recognize exactly what's going to happen, right, and when it's going to happen, you start to formulate and start to reference your psyche as to what should that feel like, what am I going to feel like, and then that starts to open the door for whatever anxiety or considerations you have going into a session or whatever. So like if you show up and it's like, okay, today is every Monday is 5x5 squat, and every week you're adding 5 pounds. Initially, it's all a new experience. So, those first several weeks are very exciting. And if it's like your new first program you've ever done, you might not have any of that set in because it's such a novel experience. But, if you do a training program where every single day is exactly the same as it was the week before, or every microcycle is basically identical in structure, and there's very little variability in that, it the first thing that starts to happen is monotony starts to set in, right? And that just to me sets the stage for the next steps of what's going to happen later. And it might not even be that that's like setting the stage for whatever, because I mean, if you're just doing a certain amount of volume, it shouldn't you shouldn't be overtrained from it. You shouldn't stagnate from it. But if you think about it from the other perspective of how can I cram even more training volume and stimulus into something, I have to make it exciting. I have to get the person to not notice as significantly what they're being asked to do, right? Um, and so that level of like variation and variability, I think, contributes to that greatly, right? You can see just how much more someone can do. It also like there's other benefits to saturating a program with a lot of variability and variation from skill acquisition, but also just from technical, like you can address technique in a much more comprehensive way. But yeah, I think there's like, just because that's an interesting thing to me is like that subtle aspect of like Shaco really showed me that like the program is all the same. It's all 5 triples and 4 doubles and same percentage, same intensities, but it's varied a lot. Not every single workout is the same. In fact, a lot of them don't feel the same and don't look the same, even though they're very similar set and rep schemes. The organization of them. Some days you have 2 bench press workouts, and some days you have one, and sometimes you have a little bit different movements. And like there's enough of that keeps the program much more stimulating to do and much more interesting to do than having all that exact same volume in a very uniform pattern.
I think that's really interesting, and I almost wonder. We kind of look at this from a few different levels. You look at it from in training intensity, you look at it from training volume or load, and then you look at it from exercise selection, and then you look at like how that stuff's constructed within a week. And I almost wonder, you always hear people, weightlifters, athletes specifically, I know the people listening are going to nod their heads in agreement, but they, it's the weekend and they're like, oh, I really want to open up my program and see what I'm doing for the week. Like, I'm really excited to
Mm-hmm.
see what my program is for the week or what my program is for the day. So there's this excitement, that there's this energy and interest in knowing like, okay, what's training look like? So I almost wonder, can you kind of like whittle away that, their perspective so they can only see one training day, and then does that start to increase kind of the novelty of it? Because when you look at the entire program or the big picture, you start to try and anticipate, or you can start to say like, oh, here's the pattern, or this is what I'm doing, this block, the next block, and the competition block. And you start to reduce all of the uncertainty and the sense of novelty and variety, because everything's like laid to bear. So I
Yeah.
wonder, how much you actually share with a person, if that can kind of change their perspective with training, so that it's like, you can go from, hey, here's a whiteboard, here's the workout of the day. They're like, okay, that looks different. That looks fun. Or you can kind of have like an entire macro cycle built out and have all the numbers, all the exercises, and say like, what you're going to do 5 months from now on the third Wednesday, and it's going to be
Yeah.
light and you're going to be beat up. And this is what that workout's going to look like. Do you think that it kind of matters if you kind of bias one or the other, as long as there's actual variability within the program?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's like it's the idea that like a lot of small effects can compound on each other, right? And it's like, how many of these little effects, how many of these little things can we compound on each other to get us to the next level, right? To get us an actual measurable improvement in performance.
Right.
And it's like, it might be that, like, yeah, any one of these little variables could be dismissed, and then at the end of the day, like, well, yeah, you had 12 different variables, 12 different things you could have capitalized a little bit on, and that might have added up to a whole 2% increase or 5% improvement, right? That wouldn't have happened in other ways, you know? It's kind of like, if you think about, like, okay, if someone's training and they're doing, they constantly overshoot their heavy sets, right? Like when you're
Right.
doing top sets of 5, and like, yeah, overshooting your top set and only doing 4 reps is like a minor thing, right? It's not going to, like, oh shit, now you're not making progress. But what are the little compounding effects of that happening again and again and again, right? A little bit too much fatigue, the, like, the slight drop in excitement about the program, and a
Mm.
little bit more, you go home kind of dejected, I'm not getting stronger. Like, those are all minor things, but they might compound over time a lot, versus somebody who, like, undershoots their sets by a tiny bit, and they feel like the opposite. Oh shit, I feel, I undershot a little bit. That's okay. I can go up the last week, or I can go up the next week, and like, they feel successful. And so, like, I say all these things because it's like the potential for, like, yeah, how much can we play with the variables we have to get the most out of them? Because at some point, the the there's a finite amount of, stuff we can give or do, right? You can only do so many reps, you can only do so much weight. So what are the next things down the line that we have to play with to actually try and, make it more effective, right? And it's like, there's a lot of that stuff, right? It's like, okay, it used to be, not no one used to do the, like, work up to a top single then back off sets, right? And that's like super common practice now in powerlifting.
Mm.
And it's like, okay, that little top single, maybe that emerged from the, like, idea of the Bulgarians, which is like, max out all the time, but it's refined now to, oh yeah, if you just give yourself a tiny bit of exposure to specific practice, and you touch a heavy single at RPE 7 or 8 or 9 or something, and then you do your back off of your normal volume work, there's just this augmentation of a lot of things. You stay in touch with the technique, you feel confident about it, you're not missing, but you're getting exposure to what it feels like to do a single. It makes the back off work feel that much easier. Like, there's a lot of little compounding effects there that if integrated to the entire system, might make a huge difference long term. And that's where I feel like the sort of, you know great programming and great coaching manifests itself, and you see it a lot with, like, you know powerlifting was like that when I got into it. It was like, programs they had to be effective, and they had to be concise. You couldn't just add tons of shit because you're already asking people to do a lot of volume.
Mm.
Shaco was a great example of that. It's like, there's just not a lot of room for just throwing in more and more shit. Like, oh, I did 4 squat sessions this week, I better throw some 8s in at the end of the week here to really polish up my hypertrophy phase. Like, it just doesn't happen. Whereas, like, if your program is just a bunch of slop that's just kind of thrown together, it's like, you might not be capturing any of those things. So, super structured, super rigid, you might miss out on some of those things, right? Negating the tiny things, like, does that RPE 8 single do anything? Does it really drive any results? Like, 1 rep at that weight? I don't know. Probably very, very little, but the compounding effect of it might be really significant. Um, yeah,
Well, I think that's when I talked about your influence from powerlifting, and how generally great coaches can take a lot of different kind of lines of information or lines of input, or lines of experience, and kind of integrate that into like a unique or a novel approach to kind of the same problem that everyone's trying to solve, which is, how do we make better weightlifters? It's like, well, if I
yeah,
have 10 different lines of information coming in, I can create a novel solution. If you have two, you're kind of limited. And I think we all know what I say we all know, but like, most people know what the training principles are. Most people know that, like, um, you kind of consider them directly or indirectly when you're writing a program. You can gauge or kind of understand a program based on how effectively it adheres to them or uses them. But then you kind of, you have Mike Tashir, who I think popularized this concept of like single at 8 and then down
Mm-hmm.
sets. But he was just kind of taking like different lines of programming, or like ways people would program, and implemented it. And then you kind of saw this with the way he thought about or implemented, Anatoly Bondarchuk's work into
Yeah.
powerlifting by having repeating microcycles until the person peaks. Then you would do, a pivot block or a washout block, and then you would transition into another mesocycle, which like for the RTS, kind of the way they do things at reactive training systems, every mesocycle, I think of it more like a macro cycle, because you're trying to achieve peak form
Mm-hmm.
with the stress that's applied. So you do 3 to 6 weeks of a very specific type of stress, you peak, and then you do like a washout to try to resensitize kind of like your ability to resensitize yourself to the training. And then
Mm-hmm.
you do another kind of like peaking block, basically. So you can kind of see like, oh, there are these really different ways of thinking about training, and they haven't been applied to powerlifting or weightlifting in that way. And when they are, it's like really effective. It takes off. People end up really liking it. And, then that's integrated into the culture of it. And then it's like normal, right? The whole single at 8 is a meme now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like a marginal gain. But that comes from, again, dipping your feet into different waters, thinking about like, okay, how can this influence weightlifting, powerlifting? How can strongmen have an influence, other sports, other training methodologies? And I think that's kind of ultimately what we're stumbling upon, is like using those different lines of information to find all of the marginal gains that exist and can be used to create a more effective program.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also like, if you look at that same kind of thing, as far as like, uh, we think about like weightlifting and what came from like powerlifting to weightlifting. I would say a good example of that is like, for a long time in weightlifting, when I did it, there was a huge movement shying away from any kind of direct hypertrophy work.
Mm.
Um, and especially as far as like upper body strength, pressing strength and just general upper body strength, which I think has shifted a little bit now. Um, I think it's a little bit different as far as like the amount of like work people do towards like building muscle mass and dedicated times, towards hypertrophy and weightlifting.
Well, and I
And I
think
think,
I think
yeah,
I think that's interesting, because it maybe before, 10, 20, 30 years ago, it seemed like there were sharper boundaries between everything. Like,
yeah,
oh, if you train like a bodybuilder, like you're building muscle in a way that's just like completely useless, and you're just like, you're going to be big but you're not going to be strong. And then, powerlifters are slow, and they lift a certain way, and that creates certain adaptations. And weightlifters are all fast twitch and, explosive, and that requires very specific training. Well, I think, part of those things can be true. I think it kind of misses out on this idea of like, no, they're just becoming experts in a very specific adaptation, or like
yeah,
set of adaptations. So looking at, maybe the way bodybuilders would train to build muscle, while it's not optimal, like really could shed some light on a lot of those concepts. So I think you kind of see that now we're getting like this blending of what seems like different sports, but it's really just like different ways of best creating the adaptation that's needed for performance. And, really strongly well periodized programs take advantage of all of that stuff.
yes,
And
yeah,
that's the the thing that like is really hard to pick up on when you get into this, because you're like, oh, the periodization, I don't know about that thing. And then you kind of figure out like, oh, that completely makes sense.
yeah. I agree with that. It's like there's definitely like the boundaries between things are much more blurry.
Right.
Um, I also think like there's just more accessibility, more knowledge all around.
Right.
I think like weightlifting coaches and stuff are more likely to, to read an article, a training article, or like a research paper, right, or something along those lines, and consider how to apply it to their own athletes, where integrate those things. Whereas like before, it was just like kind of kind of didn't exist, right? I mean, you can see it. It's like a remnant of some coaches. I've heard good coaches, top coaches in weightlifting, basically just like poo-poo science, poo-poo
Right.
research.
Yeah.
I don't need that, or I don't even remember what it is, but like, you get the idea. It's just like just stupidity, right? It's just like it's persona. It's just like an act, I think, right? Like to say like this stuff doesn't matter. I have real world experience. It's like, well, like what is that? I mean, real world experience is just your observation of what has happened, which is basically science, right? I mean, so albeit it's not systematic and it's not controlled for, so
No, and
it can be very misleading.
well, and the thing about, quote unquote science, and I think this point holds for exactly what we're talking about with all these different kind of sports having different things it can teach us, is it's not going all in and saying like, oh, I have to adhere to science. It's like science won't write you a training program.
Yeah,
Um, no one is taking an individual study and saying like, oh, they did 10 sets of 10, every set was to failure, and we have to do that because they saw statistically significant results.
yeah,
It's like that really doesn't make sense. But what does make sense is this idea of training this far from failure could potentially yield the same results as training to failure. Why is that meaningful? Because training to failure can really kind of cook you
yeah,
and create a lot of fatigue. So it's like if you can get in this from these papers or these studies or this line of research just as good of results from not training to all out fatigue, it's like that's really good. That's like a great perspective to add to your programming of like, oh, we don't need to go all out on these exercises or this training style or this training
yeah,
approach. And I think that's kind of the idea is the research informs and guides or suggests, but it doesn't prescribe, it doesn't write, and it doesn't tell. And I think that's kind of the kind of the more like, I hate to say closed off, but like limited perspective of, well, bodybuilders can't teach us anything because they're just, all they're after is aesthetics. And it's like, I don't know, man. I think there's a lot to be learned about putting on size that can effectively create force and move the weights from the floor to overhead if you just kind of like work to think about how it applies.
yeah. I agree with that a ton. I think that's one of those things. It's just like it's such a all of these things come down to critical thinking, right? It's how you interpret the universe around you, and what you can glean from talking to somebody or from reading something or from trying something, and how you can implement that into your own your own understanding of things. And then it's also like it gives you the capability to be a critical thinker. Gives you the capability to question your own
Right.
knowledge. Like, why do I do what I do? Where did I learn that from? And why am I afraid to leave that knowledge behind and move on to something different? Um, you know, it's yeah, it's interesting to me that you see a lot of coaches write the same kinds of programs,
Mm,
right? Like if you see a powerlifting coach writing like, a sort of linear or block style periodization, and you're just like, that's all they do. And it's
right.
like do they just not, even if you just wrote totally different styles of programming for the sake of learning to write your own style
Mm.
of programming better, doesn't it seem like that would be a beneficial exercise? But it's like seems like very rare you see that where somebody is like, okay, I'm gonna try to understand lots of different facets and aspects of this. Or like even a weightlifting coach. Like as a weightlifting coach, wouldn't you want to write some powerlifting programs?
Mm.
Wouldn't you want to try to write some sports performance programs? Do you think that that would like potentially improve your ability and knowledge and capacity as a coach?
Well, and
Yeah.
I think that requires a little bit of depth of understanding from the bigger picture concepts of like, if I write a sports performance program, sports are far more reliant on this concept of periodization than you could say weightlifting and powerlifting would be,
Hmm.
because they have a season, they have an off season, they have potentially like playoffs or championships. So you go from as general as you can get, the hardest kind of highest volume periods, to, you know, more medium volumes, more intensities, more specificity, and then kind of in the season, right, training is going to look far different. So there is this like strong sequencing of training. There's a very like obvious pattern, and it very much adheres to this concept of, you know, from general to specific and all the other things I listed. So it's like, oh, that's like periodization. You're planning around a competition calendar and sequencing training in a logical and effective way. So if you do that, and then you think about weightlifting, you can think about why active rest blocks, which I've been kind of thinking about, would be effective, and how structuring training in a way similar could be effective. And maybe you don't pick up on that unless you go through those thought exercises of, you know,
Yeah.
writing for sports performance or powerlifting, where, you know, force production is what you're trying to peak, which you could, you know, possibly learn from for weightlifting.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think it's like you'll learn what you don't know by trying to apply your knowledge to something slightly different, right? And you'll start to be like, oh yeah, there's a lot of things maybe I don't really grasp here that might help me in my own, my own endeavors.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I think sticks out about you, and you probably, I don't know if you intentionally did this or unintentionally, but you're one of the most like thoughtful people, I think, when it comes to training, and someone who's so open and always pursuing new information or different ways of thinking about the same information, and always iterating on the process or the system that's in place. And that's like not, I don't think that's incredibly common. And I know it feels like it is, because we create content that people consume to better understand or learn about training and influence like the way they do things. But I will say, just like seeing it firsthand, you know, it's pretty much always a process of development and refinement, and creating something new. So I think that's like, you know, props to you for always having that mindset and that approach. And if people are also thinking, which they probably are right now, I'm sure they're, you know, their fingers are ready and they want to click on that keyboard as fast as they can.
Bring it home, Josh. Sell it up.
How do I get Max Aita to coach me?
Well, you know what, Josh? Just in store for you. You can go check out any of my offerings at teamaita.com, or you can go to weightlifting.ai if you want to use the training app that has become my playground for learning and developing and building and implementing ideas. 2-week trial for 2 weeks off the first 2 weeks of the program. See how it is. Give me some feedback, because I'm constantly asking for it.
It really is. He's literally on the streets with a sign that says, I need feedback from and for weightlifting.ai. Use code 2-week trial if you already haven't to get your first 2 weeks free. That's literally all on one sign.
It's a huge piece of cardboard I have to carry around.
The burden we bear, or the burden you bear. I don't bear that burden.
So true. I'm basically Jesus Christ at this point in time.
I'll leave that there. And for Max, for Max, if you do want to get coaching from him, I think he might have said it. If not, it's teamaita.com. I'll leave that in the description. If you want to check me out, you can go to Instagram and find me at Josh_PhilWL. That is PHILWL. You can go to philosophicalweightlifting.com for most other things. If you want coaching or you want a consult and you just want to chat with me. For Onyx straps, Virus INTL, Weightlifting House, if you use the code PHILWL, that's PHILWL, you'll get 10% off on all the products purchased from those stores. Max, this was a great episode. It was a lot of fun, as always.
Yeah, it always is.
For everyone listening, thanks for the continued support, and we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the podcast.